Hello and welcome. Today I am going to teach you about South Phoenix in 4 stories. So you're going to hear stories and biographical details about real people who lived and influenced the history of South Phoenix. So as always, I am your hostess, Dr. Summer Cherland, and let's begin. So today's talk is called Where is South Phoenix in 4 stories? And I thank you for joining me. The Phoenix white settler myth goes something like this. Once upon a time, there was a Confederate defector, a heavy drinker, and morphine addict named Jack Swilling. Swilling hit proverbial gold in the 1860s when he discovered the ancient Hohokam Canal ruins. Upon those fossilized ditches, Swilling built a modern canal system that made Phoenix irrigable, farmable, and livable. Phoenix rose from the ashes and became a modern utopia, built by whites, for whites, and the tradition continued into the 20th century. But this is legend, elements of truth spun together with unhealthy doses of nostalgia. It isn't the story of Phoenix's founding. Phoenix was multiracial from the beginning, with Mexican farmers and founders moving into the valley alongside white settlers. Native American and Mexican architects designed the first buildings and taught whites how to work with adobe. Swilling himself was married to a Sonoran woman, Trinidad Escalante, and the two of them had at least 2 adopted Apache children. And like I tell everyone I talk to, if you really want to know the story, the history of Phoenix, you've got to come south. When Jack and Trinidad arrived in the 1860s, they were not the first people here. On the banks of the southern banks of the Salt River lived a small community of Mexican expatriates, new American citizens under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. They appropriated the Hohokam canals from 2,000 years ago and brought water from the river to their own farms. The same thing John Y.T. Smith and Swilling are credited for doing. Some Mexicans lived north of the river in the burgeoning downtown. Others, like Pedro Sotelo, owned land in what is today South Phoenix and Tempe. Sotelo was from a powerful family. His dad was Ignacio Sotelo, commander of the Tubac Presidio in the 1800s. Sotelo would have been considered elite. Whites and Mexicans shared in the labor and authority of this new city. So, what happened? Well, 3 events changed everything. First, the city is founded in 1870. Main streets were now Center Street, running north and south, and Washington, running east and west. Half of the 240 residents were Mexican. 11 years later, Phoenix was incorporated, and the first legislation included measures for racial segregation. Two, the railroad arrives. In 1886 and 87, 2 railroad lines were completed from Maricopa Wells. Just as soon as Mexican and native laborers finished building the tracks, Phoenix officials designated the north side for whites and the south side for people of color. Municipal funding flowed north. And three, the Salt River floods in 1892 and 93, and then a third time in the 1910s. This forced those with means further north into higher ground, leaving behind the most vulnerable living in the floodplain between the tracks and the river. So when you saw that I was going to talk to you today about South Phoenix, what did you think I meant? Does South Phoenix start at Washington Street, the railroad, the Salt River? I once interviewed a man named Gary Walters who told me he was born and raised South Phoenix. Gary told me all about growing up on Magnolia Street in the 1960s and 70s. And at the end of the interview, I asked him what I ask most narrators. Where is South Phoenix? Where does it begin and where does it end? Gary told me in no uncertain terms. South Phoenix is from the river to the mountain, 48th Street to 19th Avenue. There's just one problem. Magnolia Street, where Gary grew up, is a block north of the river. So, by his own definition, Gary, born and raised South Phoenix Walters, didn't actually grow up there. But of course he did. Who am I to question his version of events? This isn't gotcha journalism. This is local history. I saw Gary recently and I told him he's my hook every time I give this talk because there's room for interpretation. Gary's racial and socioeconomic identity has as much to do with his placement in South Phoenix as his address did. There are 3 major physiographic barriers that have historically separated the haves from the have-nots in urban planning and racial segregation. Can you guess what they are? 3 major physiographic barriers that historically have separated the haves from the have-nots. Water, railroads, and highways. And South Phoenix has all three. You know about the railroads, okay? They separated whites from people of color, and everything on the South Side was disregarded. Funding was withheld, and the city allowed both industrial and residential development on South Side of the railroad, setting in motion decades of pollution and fracturing disenfranchised communities. Many people living south of the tracks built their own homes from found materials, tents, and the like. Outdoor privies were common. Sidewalks didn't exist. Buses and streetcars didn't come south of Jefferson. From the 1930s to the 1960s, some considered this area the worst, quote, slums west of the Mississippi. Consider water, and I'm not just talking about the Salt River's flooding. There's another part of the story that's crucial to understanding how South Phoenix was formed in relation to the Salt River, and it has to do with dying in territorial Phoenix. Josefina Pogue was likely born in 1886. By 1919, she's living on Lincoln Street, just south of the railroad tracks, and working as a housekeeper. That year, Josefina's daughter, Pastasita, discovered Josefina unresponsive, bleeding from an assumed self-inflicted gunshot wound to the chest. Josefina left behind two notes written in Spanish, one to her daughter and one to an unnamed white serviceman that she was in love with. The story was covered widely in the newspapers, rare for a Mexican-American woman to get that kind of coverage. The salaciousness, though, of Josefina's apparent suicide, along with her unrequited love for an American soldier, made for a scandal. Josefina, the Arizona Republican reported, was buried in the cemetery across the river. Mexican families like Josefina's, north or south of the Salt, had very few options when it came to burials. Cemeteries wouldn't take their deceased loved ones, so many began using a potter's field near 12th Street and Weir, or south of Broadway Road for the uninitiated. That graveyard has a lot of names. It's most frequently been officially retitled the Campo Santo. It was also called the Mexican Cemetery and the Cemetery across the river. Over 400 souls are laid to rest here. None of them are marked. We do not know which one is Josefina. All of them are Mexican or Yaqui, half are children. It seems even if you lived near downtown, if you were not white, you had to go south to die. Remember how I told you that cemetery has a lot of names? Its most frequently used name is associated with some of the most famous Phoenicians. If you can, try to think of one of the biggest names in Phoenix history, one that everyone might know. And if I was giving this talk in person, I would have you shout them out to me. Typically, we get to this name, Dwight Hurd. If you may have thought of him, right? You might have thought of Dwight Hurd. The most often used name for this cemetery is the Sotelo Hurd Cemetery, possibly named for Pedro Sotelo and most definitely named for the Hurd family. Do you know how Dwight Hurd made his money? It was a combination of marrying well and buying land south of the river. May Bartlett married Dwight Hurd in Chicago in 1893. They moved to Phoenix 2 years later for Dwight's health, and together with her father founded the Bartlett Hurd Land and Cattle Company. You may actually recognize their name for their art and historical artifact collection, which is held at the Hurd Museum. You may also know of their newspaper, the Arizona Republic, which was then called the Arizona Republican. And you might even know a little bit about their omnipresence in South Phoenix. Dwight was vice president of what we call the Hurd Corporation. May's dad, Adolphus, was president and CEO, and May was CFO. She managed the money. She kept the books. This made her one of the most powerful citizens, not just women, in Phoenix. The Bartlett Hurd Company ultimately owned 7,000 acres of land south of the Salt River. They initially bought it to ranch cattle and grow alfalfa, later cotton, but something Dwight had his hands in shaped South Phoenix. See, Dwight was one of the few Western landowners who publicly promoted federal preservation and reclamation. He was friends with Teddy Roosevelt. Dwight helped pull together the Salt River Valley Water Users Association, later SRP, and he lobbied Washington for an irrigation project that would control the unpredictable Salt River. He was successful, and the very first Bureau of Reclamation project in 1911 was the Roosevelt Dam, which forever shaped Phoenix. Dwight took Teddy on a drive south over the Center Street Bridge in 1912. At the time, that was lauded as the longest concrete structure in the world. It was built in relationship with the Roosevelt Dam and financed in part by the Hurds. May, meanwhile, was busy developing South Phoenix society. She donated land to the neighborhood house, the Hurd School, and the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. But they owned too much land. In order to draw water from a BOR project, they had to own less. So they started selling land to developers to subdivide into homesteads of 120 acres or fewer. Two of the streets in the first development, Carver and Greenway, were named for Rough Riders in honor of President Roosevelt. Those developments were open only to white buyers. May outlived Dwight by 22 years exactly. They died on the same day. He in 1929, she in 1951. In the 22 years that May outlived Dwight, she saw the one-room herd school become the Roosevelt School and then the Roosevelt School District. South Mountain, which she and Dwight helped convince the city of Phoenix to purchase in 1921, became the largest municipal park and preserve in the country. The Herd Scout Pueblo, on land she donated, boasted Pueblo revival architecture and was decorated by her sister. In her lifetime, South Phoenix went from one massive ranch seemingly owned by her to dozens of developed communities, many of which remained agricultural for the next 20 years. One such subdivided community was Okemah, founded in the 1910s. The herds recruited black cotton pickers from Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas to work on their South Phoenix ranch. New black settlers could legally purchase land in one place, Okemah. Okemah was named for a Kickapoo man, and here blacks could own up to 40 acres, grow citrus and vegetables, and raise livestock. Nelson Mitchell Sr. moved to Okemah from Texas in 1943 and at 55 years old. He had only a fourth grade education, but he drew and executed those plans for his house himself. And when he was done, it was one of the most modern homes owned by an African American. It was slump block with a swamp cooler, screened-in porch, gas heat and a stovetop, a shop, a functioning toilet, and a garage. Groundwater came from a well for cooking. SRP delivered irrigation to the yard and pastures. He had a cow for milking, chickens and pigs for slaughtering, and quiet, breezy nights under mesquite, cottonwood, and pecan trees. Mitchell's home was surrounded by homegrown citrus groves, sweet peas, roses, lettuce, squash, corn, greens, and all other sorts of vegetables and fruits. His 3.5-acre homestead was located north of Broadway at Route 1, Box 426, Tempe, Arizona, even though blacks were barred from buying homes in Tempe until the 1970s. Mitchell's family attended Willow Grove Church, named for the willow tree, where the congregation used to gather before there was a chapel on Miami Street. Baptisms took place in the canal just off Transmission Road, today's University, and 40th Street. Nelson Mitchell III was born in 1953. He and his siblings, Cynthia and Linwood, attended 40th Street School in Okemah. It was an all-black school because African Americans were segregated in elementary and high school. Even though they had Tempe addresses, Tempe schools paid Roosevelt schools over $200 per child to take black kids from their district. 40th Street School, also called Okemah School, had no playground, no cafeteria, outdated books, and broken desks, as well as a stern but devoted principal named Letha Slaughter. Slaughter, like other women in the community, looked out for the kids and protected them. She ensured that they got the best education in the city, and these kids went on to win national awards, attend major universities, earn doctorates, and law degrees. Also in Okemah lived a girl named Gloria. When Gloria was in high school, she tried many times to sneak into Tempe High. Her house, after all, was in Tempe and on the bus route. So more than once, Gloria boarded the Tempe school bus and rode to the nearby high school. She was always turned away. Instead, she enrolled at South Mountain High School, which opened in 1956. Every day when Gloria walked into school, she passed under the Confederate flag, which hung just below the Arizona state flag. South High's mascot was the Rebel, a stars and bars wielding Southern soldier. Black girls were not allowed to play tennis, but every year Gloria enrolled in a gym class that taught tennis. Every year she got a call from the front office telling her that her schedule had been changed because she couldn't take that PE class. Gloria Nelson and their Okemah friends bummed rides, rode the city bus, or walked from South Mountain High on 7th Street and Southern down Broadway Road to Okemah on 40th Street. Now, have you heard much of Okemah? You probably have in this class. And many of us have heard of Eastlake, the older Black community on the north side of the river. But what happened to Okemah? Where is its history? What was that third physiographic feature we talked about? You know, the kind that separates races in city planning: water, railroads, and highways, with the side of airport expansion. In the early 1960s, the city condemned and demolished the Mitchell House. Plans for Interstate 10's Broadway curve went right through the Mitchell property. Nearby, Josephine Pete, who grew up in Okemah and attended 40th Street School, then Percy Julian, then South Mountain High, stayed close to home into adulthood. She began teaching at the new Palmdale School and later Central High School. In the 1970s, Phoenix Union High School District offered Pete a vice principal position at one of two schools. She could go to South Mountain High or another school in the district. Josie said, "Send me home." She later became the first woman and the first Black to be principal at South Mountain High. Now, Principal Dr. Josie, who went to school with Gloria when they were the Rebels, was part of a movement to change the mascot from Rebel to Jaguars. All the while, Josie was watching her family's property on 40th Street and Superior carved up by freeway development and expansion. Broadway curve construction decimated Okemah beginning in 1971. It cut right through the heart of the community. The Durango curve, just a few miles west, had done the same to three Hispanic historic barrios, and those communities had been around for nearly a century. Okemah became unrecognizable. What the freeway didn't take, the industry did. The city didn't protect this residential agricultural area from industrial development. They left it zoned for mixed use. And its new proximity to the freeway made it attractive for warehouses, distribution yards, and factories. Today, there are still a few original Okemah structures standing, namely Willow Grove Church and a couple houses behind Chain Link. But if you go slow on 40th Street, you can catch a glimpse of the canal that used to host baptisms, and you'll probably get honked at. After World War II, more African Americans moved to Phoenix, and a lot of them didn't want a homestead. They wanted suburban houses, right? Many of them had GI Bill funding, but couldn't buy houses anywhere because Phoenix was redlined. So they could wait for a home to open up in Eastlake or get creative. Travis Williams got creative. Along with members of his family, Williams founded the Progressive Builders Association in 1945. They were the first Black-owned construction company in Arizona, and they built homes, beautiful homes for Black aspirational families. They bought a sliver of property just south of Broadway Road from Kemper Marley and began building developments like Princess Jean, Carlotta Place, and Sheridan Park. PBA was innovative, not just because it was the first, but because it challenged national trends of declining Black home ownership in the post-war. In 1961, the Phoenix Urban League found that of the 31,000 new homes built north of the tracks, not one single home was sold to a Black buyer. But conversely, almost 100% of Williams' clientele was African American. This created a thriving, supportive community of Black leaders, politicians, and culture makers in Phoenix. They headquartered on Broadway Road along with Sun Valley Life Insurance in the Hartco Plaza. Sun Valley was started by Goldie Hart and her husband. It was the first Black-owned insurance company in Arizona. Goldie, who was a teacher in the Roosevelt schools, is remembered for being the first Black woman principal in Roosevelt, even though it didn't happen until her appointment in 1971 at TG Bar. But we all know that Letha Slaughter preceded her by about 3 decades, but that's okay. We celebrate all the achievements around here. And speaking of achievements, one of these days, consider driving down Baseline Road. We sometimes call it the Baseline Highway. Baseline was set in 1868 as a starting point for the Bureau of Land Management's first land survey of the Phoenix area. They called the mountains and the surrounding area, quote, unfit for cultivation. They were wrong. Beginning in the 1930s, 7 Japanese American families hand cultivated that very land along South Mountain foothills for what would become a vast empire of citrus, vegetables, and most notably, flowers. The first to arrive was Kojiro Kishiyama, who rented 60 acres on 36th Street and Baseline in 1936. He launched a successful truck farm, built a house made of hay, and spent years digging rocks out of the earth. Kishiyama recruited the Nakagawa family from California to join him, and 5 other families followed. But when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in 1942, anyone of Japanese descent living south of Grand Avenue was sent to a concentration camp. When World War II ended, they returned to Baseline to find their homes vandalized and farming equipment stolen. Japanese-born immigrants could not purchase property, so undeterred, their family members helped them out. George Kishiyama, who as a youngster had been termed the Tomato King on his dad's farm, wanted to help, but he was out of the country. So his sister Iko purchased the land her dad had originally settled at 36th and Baseline and held the deed for him. She went to jail for that. Nick Nakagawa, meanwhile, bought his family's home across the street. Eventually, George and Nick took over operations from their fathers. In the 1950s, they began experimenting with growing flowers as well as citrus and vegetables. It was an immediate success. Soon, all seven Japanese American families strategically grew roses, chrysanthemums, stock, and sweet peas all along Baseline Road, with produce grown in the back of the farm. The Japanese flower gardens, as they became known, were a sensation. Tourists from all over the country visited the acres of flowers at the base of a desert mountain. Nick Nakagawa built a two-story observation pagoda to attract tourists. But here's the thing, they didn't just grow flowers. They fed the city. These were huge truck farms that every week brought fresh produce to town, where grocers bought it and stocked their shelves with locally grown lettuce and squash, beans, corn, citrus berries, and the like. And people remember the flower gardens, their smell, the cool air they generated at the base of the mountain, and their beauty fondly. It's heartbreaking, really. Global markets put an end to the local floral industry. Development brought squatters and partiers and vandals to the fields. The land became too expensive to maintain. The price to sell was right. The kids grew up, and none had interest in the family business, except one. Nick Nakagawa's daughter, Kathy, is professor emeritus at Arizona State University. And when she retired in 2021, she took over her dad's shop at 36th and Baseline. The place had a sterling reputation and an established customer base, but it needed some TLC. Kathy fixed it up, bringing in local microgrowers from all over the state. She put up a photo op and opened a lounge. Go see Kathy. She'll give you a tour and show you a ton of photos. Her desk sits on the foundation of the old pagoda, and if that tower were still there, climbing it would give you an uninspired glimpse of apartment complexes, tract homes, and a lot of traffic on Baseline Road. But Kathy knows what used to be there. Let's take a pause. By studying South Phoenix, we are learning about all of these things. Phoenix's multiracial founders, more about the most powerful families like the Herds, a forgotten territorial cemetery and the Mexican pioneers buried there, Black homesteading in the early 20th century, Black, Hispanic, and Asian innovators and pioneers in the West, community developers of all races, self-reliance, civil rights, and community control, pre- and post-war housing, tourism in the Southwest, nostalgia, legacies, and how historical narratives function and listen. This speech could be a whole lot longer. There's so much more. So where is South Phoenix? Is it everything south of the tracks? South of the river? Does Tempe count? Levine? What about South Mountain Village? What's that? Well, my question began not with where is South Phoenix in geography. It began with where is South Phoenix in historiography. Let me tell you why we're even doing this research in the first place. In 2017, I was teaching a class called Arizona History. It was a small class, 12 students ranging in ages, races, and backgrounds, but all from neighborhoods near the college. I was new to South Mountain Community College. I thought it would be fun to do a class research project. I told the students to pick a topic pertaining to Arizona history, and then I would show them how to research. They chose South Phoenix. Awesome, I thought. What a great opportunity to teach them local history, research methods, and for me to learn a little bit more about my new college and my community. Historians, do you remember? How do we start research? There are two kinds of sources we need. This is where we started. I told them about secondary sources, and we went looking for books, articles, documentaries, and websites on the history of Phoenix. We found just a few. Luckingham, Whitaker, Melcher Ross, and a few others who've published. We've asked our librarian and our libraries, state archives, ASU, Salt River Project, and I'm pretty sure we've called in every favor across the state that we could. How do you think we did at first, looking for secondary sources on South Phoenix history? It didn't look good. Mostly what we ended up with were stories, anecdotes about South Phoenix, hundreds of photos of the Japanese flower gardens, and a lot of dead ends. I received at least 7 apologetic emails from librarians, and the problem was, and my students knew this better than me, the history was out there. There just wasn't a narrative to start with. We were in a vacuum. I told them, we can't do this. I can't ethically expect you all to fill in this narrative. This is a community college class, and we have 12 weeks left. What we are talking about is professional, graduate level research that needs to be done. Let's just pick a new topic. How about baseball in Arizona? 12 confused faces looked back at me, and one of them said, Dr. C, if we don't do this, who will? So we launched the South Phoenix Oral History Project. Those 12 students developed the mission, a student-led initiative to capture and preserve the history of South Phoenix. They created a research plan, interviewed anyone they could think of, designed their ideal website, and put into motion what is now a massive digital and physical collection of history pertaining to South Phoenix. Over 350 students and 200 narrators have been involved. Along with the website since 2017, we've produced the following, all listed on your screen: documentaries, peer-reviewed journal articles, a manuscript in process, several multimedia pieces, a walking tour, a driving tour, a special collection archive in the South Mountain Community Library, and a community survey called Where is South Phoenix? But what of that geography question? Now, for nearly a decade, we keep running into this question time and time again. Where is South Phoenix? And typically people mean in geography. Well, by doing this research, these are the initial lessons we found. One, it's not an official municipality. No one mails letters to South Phoenix, Arizona. Two, it's complicated. A few years ago, I was doing a drive around, and what it sounds like. I load people into my car and we drive around historic neighborhoods talking about South Phoenix. In this one drive around, my friend Liz was driving and I was in the back seat. In the passenger seat sat Irma Payan of Arizona Barrios fame, and her longtime friend Ray sat next to me in the back seat. Irma grew up in Harmon Park on 7th on the south side of Pima. Ray grew up in the Marcos de Niza projects north of the same exact street. And I asked them as we were driving around Grant Park, I said, would you consider this South Phoenix? Ray, next to me, said, absolutely. Irma turned around in her seat so she could face me. I told you, she scolded. It's complicated. 3, the boundaries have shifted. As more people and advancements came to the valley, South Phoenix shifted further and further south. And 4, there's no real agreement among scholars, residents, city officials. It's all up for debate. Not all groups agree where South Phoenix is, and depending on who's asking and what period we're talking about. So if we're going to study a place, how do we determine where that place is? We use archival research, oral histories, and we've created a community survey. And I think we've got ourselves an idea as to where South Phoenix is. Inspired by Walter Nugent's famous 1992 article, Where is the American West? Notes on a Survey, we simply started asking people. We added a question to our oral histories and we launched a community survey. Our survey was conducted online over the course of 2.5 years. Our goal was 100 responses and we surpassed that. Students supported the collection phase, survey respondents answered demographic information, and then we provided 6 questions within the survey. 1, where is South Phoenix? 2, how have the boundaries changed? 3, what are the characteristics of South Phoenix as you have defined it? 4, please describe South Phoenix's landmarks. 5, if you're not in South Phoenix and you are traveling to get there, how do you know you've arrived? And 6, what are your impressions of the geographical, historical, and demographic makeup of South Phoenix? Respondents also had a chance to draw or map their boundaries. Some submitted incredibly detailed and complex maps. Others were more general. Both were very helpful. Do you want to know what our conclusions were? Well, let's start with the southern boundary. Though Baseline and Dobbins Road were cited often, the most overwhelming consensus identified South Mountain itself as the southernmost border of the neighborhood. And we think this underscores a deep-seated connection that residents hold with the land. Northern boundary, the Salt River or Rio Salado, is overwhelmingly mentioned as the defining northern edge. Some occasionally reference Washington or Van Buren streets, but these are far less frequent, suggesting that they are more of a historical reference than a widely accepted boundary. To the east, the 48th Street and Interstate 10 are most often cited, indicating kind of a moderate consensus, but Guadalupe, the city or town of Guadalupe, and Tempe are mentioned as a point of reference, but not as a clear boundary. This gives us some ambiguity. Now, on the western boundary, 19th Avenue is mentioned most frequently, though 27th is sometimes mentioned, and generally the western boundary is fairly ambiguous. Beyond the boundaries themselves, we discovered a few other conclusions. While some boundaries like South Mountain and the Salt River are widely accepted, others are more fluid. And this shows us that the boundaries of South Phoenix aren't simply lines on a map. They are personal, shaped by cultural, historical, and socioeconomic connections to the area. But we were able to discern a few conclusions. 1, generally we found that traditionally marginalized and environmentally burdened, South Phoenix was shaped by a complex history, as I've discussed, of racial segregation and thriving community traditions. However, it faces an uncertain future full of promise and potential loss. We also created a couple areas of opportunity. One, rebranding. And that's where we all come in, right? I'm going to give you an example. Whenever I speak to people who don't live or work in South Phoenix, I am never surprised to hear when they use the words down there to describe South Phoenix. I didn't know there was a college down there. Oh, I haven't been down there since I was a kid. We used to go down there to see the Japanese flower gardens. Meanwhile, longtime educators, residents, and activists don't call it that. In fact, they remind us that the further south you go, the higher in elevation. We prefer to call it up here. We have glorious views of downtown Phoenix, and sometimes it feels like the wide open blue sky is just out of our reach. An opportunity to commemoration. We need to find ways to celebrate and honor South Phoenix's heritage, the way they do in Litchfield Park and Paradise Valley. The South Phoenix Oral History Project and South Mountain Community College can do some of that, but the onus is on the community and the city of Phoenix itself to include South Phoenix in its promotional materials. Likewise, archival and historical institutions should focus more on our community than they have at this point. So what now? Well, the questions continue. I still love asking narrators, colleagues, and friends, just like all of you, where is South Phoenix? What are its boundaries? Intellectually speaking, this is one of the most rewarding questions I ever get to ask, but beyond my own curiosity, the rewards of this research have given and keep giving. We now have a fairly well-defined area of study, as well as a confident grasp of the exceptions. And concretely, most of what I've shared with you today is directly from this massive article that a colleague and I have written over the last year and a half, and we've now submitted to a preeminent journal. We're attempting to define the research boundaries, but also solidify those in the scholarship. And finally, this one's the most fun. We just put pen to paper and created this map. Now, I am the very amateur artist and cartographer, so please be kind. But take a moment and look at this map. I'm going to ask you two questions. You probably will recognize them. What do you notice? What do you wonder? Take a look. Take a look. What do you notice? And what do you wonder? In 2024, the South Phoenix Oral History Project launched a driving tour of historic South Phoenix, many sites that reference today's talk. Hundreds of students, residents, and visitors have boarded charter buses and school vans to visit the sites and see the complex history of South Phoenix before their eyes. The tour starts at South Mountain Preserve with a visit to historic Huhagam petroglyphs, then winds through former cotton and alfalfa fields at the base of the mountain, new home to million-dollar mansions, some across the street from 1940s dilapidated HUD homes. The tour takes visitors to Broadway Road, past dozens of automotive shops and gas stations that opened in the 1950s, and through several Williams and Jones neighborhoods. Throughout, riders catch glimpses of Dwight Hurd's palm trees. New construction appears at what seems like every stoplight. But the tour showcases a South Phoenix defined by many conflicting ideologies. This place is both rural and urban. It is white and privileged, but multicultural and poor. It was founded by Mexican-American pioneers whose names are practically lost to history. It was cultivated by Black innovators, and it is being radically changed by outside investors. So it should come as no surprise that many on the bus disembark wondering where South Phoenix begins and where it ends, and who do they trust with that answer? Every so often, someone asks me, are you still researching South Phoenix? Or with less sophistication, when will you be done? I'm trying to find a graceful way to say, you'll have to pry this story from my cold, dead hands. Here's what I know. If we had stopped with 100 or 150 interviews, a respectable number, we would have never met Josie Pete, which means we would have never conducted any interviews about Okima. We wouldn't have interviewed Mark Lamb, and we would have never known about Josefina Pogue or the Sotelo Herd Cemetery. And just when I think I've got the hang of it, someone challenges me a little. Several months ago, an archivist from the SRP called me, wanting to know a little bit more about a 100-year-old neighborhood of primarily Mexican-American families. It's less than a square mile on 7th Street in Southern. I had to admit I knew nothing about that little slice of South Phoenix. There's more to do. There are communities throughout this region that we know their stories are undertold, and we can help right the wrong. That's the job. Alex Haley said in 1973 that it was the wrinkled, graying ancestors, friends of his grandmother, who hold all the history. In recliners and at kitchen tables, the grandparents, tias, and neighbors of my students, those first 12 and the 350 cents, hold the key to solving what Haley called history written by the winners, messed up from the very beginning. I know each of these stories that I just told you. May Hurd, Nelson Mitchell, Josefina Pogue, Kathy Nakagawa. I know these stories as you've heard them today because my students researched them, primarily through interviews with people they may already know, might stand behind in line at Starbucks or honk at on 40th Street. This is what makes our research, oral history, and local history so important. We see in real time the significance of our research. These are students, your students, community college students from some of the most disenfranchised neighborhoods in the city by design from the moment the city was founded, who are doing professional level research on their own community and they're making it matter. What an incredible teaching tool we have at our disposal. What an incredible community building tool we have at our disposal. Think for a moment about the kind of confidence this might inspire. Think about the value and the potential you might have as a result of just interviewing your grandpa. It's good stuff. You can't plagiarize an interview. AI, Chat GPT, it can't fix a narrative with major gaps in it because there's nothing to draw from. If we don't do this, who will? And like I said, if you want to know anything about Phoenix history, you've got to come south.